So, new idea. I'll tell you what I thought of a game series, game by game, and I'll do it quickly. Like 1 minute per game quickly. Welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm your host, OC Trinity, and after a few episodes of this, I'm sure you'll remember me. For the first episode of the show, we're running down Metroid. It's arguably the series that defined the non-linear platformer, with it being very common to backtrack across previously explored territory, with lots of individual items and upgrades for your character to become more powerful or explore areas you couldn't reach before, all to destroy some alien parasites and space pirates. Later on, though, the series revamped itself into a first-person shooter while still maintaining the general feel of the older games. This review will cover 9 games out of the series. Which ones still hold up, and which ones should you pass on? The game that started it all actually had most of the familiar elements we're used to. There's lots of collectible power-ups and missiles to collect, as well as a surprisingly big world to explore with no obvious right way to go. I mean, sure, you know you need to defeat 2 bosses, Ridley and Kraid, before moving on to the final area, but you got nothing else to go on. However, there is a heavy amount of copy-pasting on the level design. Combining that with the lack of an in-game map, you'll find it surprisingly easy to get lost. Sure, this is fairly reminiscent of several other games of the time, asking you to figure out literally everything for yourself, and of all the games in the series, this definitely goes the furthest. I can't really dock it points for this since it's subjective on whether or not this is good. What I can dock it for, though, is that there's a bit of a lack of balance. It's very hard to grind for missiles or energy, and towards the end of the game you're going to need to do just that. Before that becomes an issue, it's pretty clear that you're going to need to find all of the permanent upgrades before you go out and defeat any of the bosses. But let's face it, for a game that practically invented the genre, or at least a specific style thereof, it got a lot right. A few years after the first game, Nintendo released a sequel for the Game Boy. In the process, it lost a decent amount. For one, the game flow feels a bit too standardized. There's a clear objective with killing off every Metroid on the map, and as Metroids are defeated, new areas open up via an acid pool sinking further. On one hand, this means you have a very strong indication of where your next mark actually is, except not really. The game tends to use a lot of hidden passages, and later, once you have space jump, passages that are completely out of the way and unexpected. So the exploration tends to get more tedious looking for that one place you overlooked before. Probably worse than that, though, is overall the game speed feels slow. It feels like it takes a while to get anywhere, and sometimes the action gets slow enough that you can predict exactly what's going to happen well before it actually does. Of all the games in this review, I'm prepared to call this one the least memorable. All that said, though, it's not like this game doesn't have its positive points. The game does feel less grindtastic with some energy and missile refillers right away, and the game gets things going very quick compared to the rest of the series. I don't know if I can get away with saying this as my opening statement without sounding like a fanboy, but I'm not going to pull my punches. This is far and away the best game in this series, one of the best games of its time, and possibly one of the best games of all time. Compared to the previous 2 games, there's a loose structure that still manages to be pretty open to variation, even more so with some glitch abuse. No wonder this game is so popular with the speedrun community. The addition of an in-game map also makes the world easier to navigate without putting too much hand-holding on exactly where you're supposed to go next. All of the bosses feel fresh and unique, the abilities Samus gets are more varied yet not all required to finish the game, and simply put, there's so much to find that there's going to be a lot of replay value to find everything you missed. If anything, this was the game that inspired a lot of other Metroid-like games, Castlevania Symphony of the Night probably being the best example of that, and it's easy to see why, as even now, more than a decade and a half after its release, it's still a shining star and the game everyone will compare to if the games are even remotely related. You know those games where the developers try to take a game into a different direction, then realized afterwards they completely misread the fans and didn't understand what they liked about the games? Well, here's a shining example of that. The issue here is that before we've had a very bare-bones story with little to no interruptions. Here you'll be checking in with Adam, your computer navigator, every 20 or 30 minutes to give you a new objective or at least a location to go. Is this necessarily bad? Well, no, unless you prefer to go pretty much anywhere without restrictions. There's actually more variation than it sounds like, since something tends to go wrong or you need to find an alternate path to check back in. Then again, collecting new abilities is plot significant, so if you're out to explore for the sake of collecting things, you're really just searching for missile pods and energy tanks, and missiles get pretty much useless by the end of the game anyway. And speaking of that, it's very hard to gain energy back at that point too. Essentially, expect a huge difficulty spike at the end of the game. If you like your games open-ended, you're probably going to be disappointed, but if you don't mind being railroaded a bit, it's a solid game. First off, this was marketed as a remake of the original Metroid. I generally don't like video game remakes. I mean, if you're going to take a standard game but change it so much it doesn't really resemble the original product much, why even bother calling it a remake? Here you can tell a lot looks like it was done using the original Metroid as a base, but heavily changed into something new, something you as a player won't really be able to use the original as a guide. But as a remake, they get a lot right here. For one, the original unmodified Metroid is an unlockable bonus, so if you want only one of the two games, go with this one. But going back to the new game, the gameplay feels more along the side of Super Metroid. The game speed feels closest to that, and there's a clear sequence the game's expecting, but not really requiring you to follow. Of particular note is the end of the game, where you have an extra chapter involving Samus having to sneak through the pirate base, Metal Gear style, to regain lost abilities. I wouldn't call this a total replacement of the original game, since it does enough different to stand out on its own, but if you preferred the series' later gameplay style, you'll probably enjoy this one more than the original. Let's get one important thing about me out of the way. I hate first-person shooters. The concept of being able to get hit by an object that's not on the screen without any indication I was ever in danger is a concept I can't believe people accept. Fortunately, this game avoids most of the tropes most other FPSs get wrong. Here, the emphasis really isn't so much on shooting, but exploring, just like most other Metroid games, and there's still a huge non-linear world with only suggestions on where you're supposed to check out next, also just like the other games. And we get some new interesting elements like visors that detect thermal or X-ray vision. I imagine they were also trying to allow for variety with different weapons, each of which have different elemental properties, but usually you're best off just using whichever you got most recently. Sure, there's still some issues with control. We're not using the same dual-stick control set made popular by Halo, and the one here does not work well with dealing with swarms of enemies. And while I'm usually not averse to backtracking, the end game here, which requires finding 12 artifacts whose locations are all over the place, seems a bit much. But all that said, I'm prepared to state this is an excellent 3D follow-up to the 2D games before it. Gameplay here is nearly identical to the game before it. From a level design perspective, though, there's a Dark World aspect whose design schematics seem lifted off Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, similar in structure to the other world, but different enough. Different weapons are actually useful this time, with the Light and Dark Beam having clear strengths and weaknesses, and both of which have limited ammo. Also, they add a damage ring so you know which direction your attackers hit you from. Looking at everything on paper, it seems like most of the issues were addressed, and yet it doesn't quite get everything right to call it a better game. For one, the structure here is too predictable. You'll track down one of the items you lost in the beginning or an entirely new item, always accompanied by a boss fight. Repeat that to 3 or 4 more times before going to a longer, more difficult boss fight that eventually secures the entire region from darkness, and unlocks the next one to do it all over again. The end game seems a bit more tedious than Prime 1's, which is along the same lines, but unlike the first game where you could start collecting early, here it's pretty much inaccessible until the very end. In spite of my complaints, though, it's safe to say that if you did like the other Prime games, you'll probably like this one too. Nintendo stepped up to the Wii here, and as usual for them, added some pointing and motion controls. And in a shooting game, pointing controls actually make sense and provide a control set that's arguably an improvement over anything else we've seen in FPS games, though it would probably work even better if it could track your Wiimote moving outside the screen. The addition of a hyper mode where Samus becomes more powerful at the cost of depleting an entire energy tank sounds cool on paper, but it's a bit forced at times by pretty much requiring it on certain enemies, and arguably makes the game too easy when it's not forced. In fact, really, the whole game feels like it's a serious step down from the difficulty of the rest of the series. And again, I can point to waggle control being part of this. The game does have some creative use of it, but very little of it happens when you're in combat or otherwise need to make sure you do it right, so the point gets rendered moot. One thing that is pretty cool is that we go to different planets, all of which have different atmosphere to them. They've also integrated Samus' ship into the game a little more, but you're still picking up mostly useless missile pickups for the ship itself, so it looks like it was meant to do more. Of the Prime games, this is probably the weakest of the three, but by so little that if you like the first two, again, it's worth it to complete the series. I like to think this game was an attempt to bridge together the people that like the original platforming style of earlier Metroids and the FPS style of the Prime series, except it doesn't really pull off either and instead comes off as a fast-paced story-driven action game. That said, it's funny how much a game can get wrong and yet still manage to be fun. Chief among the issues is the storyline. Peering into Samus' inner monologue that depicts her as more shell-shocked than anyone would expect, though certainly a source of controversy, really isn't too much of a problem considering we never knew too much about her personality to begin with. But from a storyline perspective, the idea of waiting to use previous abilities doesn't make sense either. I mean, is the CO trying to get Samus killed? Or at least barely surviving? On Control, the game probably would have been more playable if they had more options. NES style only does not seem like the ideal choice here. Recovering health seems like a pain because the only place you can do that is when you're critically low on health to begin with. And the first-person segments generally don't seem all that fair or interesting. In spite of all that, simply put, the game gets the rest right. The combat's very solid and has a way of throwing a lot at you without overwhelming you, and the post-game content delivers well with a bonus boss that needs to be seen to be believed. So that's all for Metroid, but there's also two other DS games I haven't reviewed, Metroid Prime Hunters and Metroid Prime Pinball. One thing to point out here is that unlike most of Nintendo's other games, there is a continuing storyline with the series that goes out of release date order, but doesn't need to be fully understood to enjoy the whole series. The rumor mill is telling us that another game will show up for the Wii U as well, but there seems to be another game, Metroid Dread, that's been rumored for a lot longer that I could very well see showing up for the 3DS. I'm confident we'll be seeing another game in the series at some point within the next couple years, though. Until then, take whatever games in here you think you might like. Between the bargain bin and the Virtual Console, none of these should be that hard to find. And check back in a couple weeks for the next episode of 1 Minute Rundown, where we'll check out another series Samus has appeared in. See you then, and remember, the last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Any objections, Adam?
Objection!